Welcome to the Puberty Prof podcast, where information and tools are shared to help you have conversations about puberty and other growing up topics. Here is your host, Lori Reichel, the Puberty Prof, a nationally recognized health educator, author of the award-winning book, Common Questions Children Ask About Puberty, and creator of the Talk Puberty app.
Hi, and welcome to the Puberty Prof podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lori Reichel, the Puberty Prof. Today's episode is focusing on a life skill that we definitely need to teach to preteens, because as they get older, they need to become more and more independent, because that's part of growing up. And what we need to teach them is decision making. So that's the life skill that we're going to focus on for today's episode. And I promise you, if you're like, I'm not sure how to do this, by the end of today's episode, you'll have some tools that will equip you to do that. And if you're a young person listening in, it's going to be neat because you could apply what we're going to talk about today to a variety of experiences in your life. To help discuss how we make decisions, how to best make decisions, I invited Kathleen Vogt, who I ran into at a conference at the New York State AFERD conference. And she just had this wonderful positive energy, and her passion for helping young people was so apparent. So I thank you so much for being here today, Kathleen. Would you like to say hi to our audience?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Lori. Hi, everybody. I'm Kathleen Vogt, zooming in from Poughkeepsie, New York.
Do you mind telling us a little bit about your background, Kathleen?
Sure. So I'm in my 18th year of teaching health education, specifically 8th graders in a middle school setting. So throughout the day, I also interact with 6th and 7th graders. I've been a coach. I've coached swimming, track. I've been a club advisor. So I've worked with a bunch of different age groups. I'm also, on a personal note, very close with my niece, who's going to be 10 next month. And I take my role as aunt very seriously, and I cherish that relationship. So when I was thinking about decision making for preteens, especially, she was in my mind, as I've seen her change so much in just the last year. So yeah, it's a little bit about me.
Well, it's so neat that, like in middle school, you do see that difference from 6th grade to 8th grade. And then I'm sure elementary school teachers, if they were to see their former students in middle school, they'd be like, oh, it's so different, even from 5th to 6th grade.
Yeah.
And as I said, children are getting older, and it's not just their physical bodies that are changing, it's their emotions and their mental health, their social health, their spiritual health. So this whole skill set of decision making is so imperative for them to know. Do you remember your preteen years, just out of curiosity?
I do. When I got the job to teach 8th grade, I always thought I wanted to teach high school. And then when I was thinking about 8th grade and reflecting back on that time, I wish I had a mirror in front of me, because I was just like, oh, it was not the fondest time. Middle school was rough, especially navigating friendships. I think that is tough, as you're trying to figure out who you are, and who maybe you've been friends with for so long, but then your interests start to change or your values change. So the friendship piece was definitely a challenge.
So when I say decision making, which I'm sure you had to make a lot of decisions about those friendships when you were growing up, in your eyes, as a health educator, as a human being on this planet, why do you believe decision making skills are so important?
Well, during this time, they're becoming independent, like you said. They're spending less time with their families, perhaps more time with their peers. And so it's exciting, it's, wonderful, but also really scary. So I think helping kids understand how to go through a decision-making process, what that even means, can at least give them some confidence in being able to make a choice when they're on their own.
Have you seen, since you've worked with middle school children, have you seen that there are already some important decisions these young people are making?
Yeah, What I have started to see more of, actually, which I think is great, is when they know to get an adult involved. I wish they would do it a little bit more, where there might be drama between friends. The lunchroom is a perfect example. And there's quarreling and they don't quite know how to communicate how they're feeling or how to work through a conflict. And so that brings in another skill of communication, but just even knowing what they need to make a decision about, with whatever quarrel they might be, facing. And then I think too, just how they're going to spend their time, their activities. They may have been exposed to a lot of different things in elementary school, and now they're getting into middle school and academics are becoming more important. So they might not be able to do so many activities. So which ones are they going to let go? And which ones are they going to focus more on?
You reminded me of a book that is out there. It's called, I think it's The 5 Biggest Decisions You'll Ever Make for Teenagers. And Sean Covey had written it. It's aligned with Stephen Covey, who wrote The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And then his son did The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Teens. But have you heard of that 5 Decisions book? I think that's the title.
I have.
Because I think what you had said about its relationships, that's a major decision children would make. And then things about substances.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Stuff about
Yes.
schooling. I'm not remembering all 5 decisions. I'm sorry, I haven't looked at the books in a couple of years. I know too, the whole thing about sexuality and romantic relationships. I know that there was a small part in there because that is an important decision for a young person. Although a lot of preteens aren't there yet to make that decision, especially when they don't have the age of consent, because you have to be a certain age in every state in the United States. But I had reached out to you and asked when we were planning to talk for this episode, I reached out to ask, do you have an acronym that you use to teach how to make the best decisions? And if you do you mind explaining what that is?
Yeah, sure. So we have been using the DECIDE model.
Okay.
So D for defining the decision that you have to make, right? So boiling it down to what's the problem here. E for exploring options. And that's where, when I'm teaching this to the students, I really try to push them to think beyond just the 2 obvious ones, because then you get a little bit more creative, and you might come up with something that you didn't initially think about. I think that's also where involving another person can be helpful too, right? Enlisting the help of an adult to help you come up with more options that you might not be thinking about. And then C, consider consequences, which is, consequential thinking. What can happen? What are the pros and cons of each of my options? And this is the part that I stress with the students, and I really try to get them to think. We know that their brains are still developing, right? So to be able to think ahead, before maybe they even find themselves in certain situations, right? That's part of the practice.
Mm-hmm.
And then identifying values. We'll talk about things that influence us. So values is one of those things. And, making sure that whatever option you're leaning towards is going to honor, who you're trying to be as a person. I get pretty passionate about values because I try to tell, people that this is your brand. Your values are, who you're showing yourself to the world, who you are. So I hope that they make decisions that are aligned with their values. And then D, decide and act, right? Which option, after you've weighed all of the pros and the cons, is going to be best for you, which might be different than your friend. And then evaluating, making sure you take the time to think after it. Are you happy with the results? Would you do something differently next time if you were in a similar situation?
Yeah. Thank you. I know that there's sometimes workshops that go over the DECIDE model, and there's other acronyms out there. Yet, as Kathleen had said, and this acronym of DECIDE, it actually breaks down that you don't just go right to the answer, this is what I'm going to do. And it goes step by step, what is it that I really need to decide upon? And then breaking it down. Because I personally am a processor. If you ask me, are you interested in doing this? I most likely would be like, can I sleep on it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm similar too. I think the more information too, sometimes, some decisions you need to ask questions, and I think letting people know it's okay to ask questions before you arrive at a decision is important. That way you truly are able to weigh all the pros and the cons.
And I'm so excited that more people have become aware of mindfulness and that practice of taking a breath, because to me, part of that decision making process, like you had referred to, that value clarification, that taking a breath, being mindful of, wait a minute, what is it I believe in? What are my values, is so important, because you want to make sure you're taking the ride you bought the ticket for. You're living your life, not your friends' lives,
Yeah.
not a peer who's trying to pressure you to do something, but who am I and what decision best aligns with who I am?
Yeah. 100% agree.
Now, do you have any examples, like from students or something that pops into your head for those preteen years that a person can apply the DECIDE model to?
I don't know if it's hard to think of like major decisions, right? I mean, except as a preteen, you feel like everything is major. um, but I think even just habits related to wellness, like when to go to sleep,
Mm,
as they start using social media, you know,
yeah.
how am I interacting with the social media? Am I happy when I'm using this, or is it actually hurting how I feel?
I love that. I love that, because for them to decide, like, at what time do they turn off the social media and how much should they have it in their life, in which I do have another episode during this year 2023 about self-regulation skills. How do I help young people as well as myself get disconnected from all that media, all those messages? So that's a
Yeah.
perfect example. And you made me think of something else, in which some people might be like, well, that's not really about puberty, but it certainly is a new potential experience for young people during those preteen into teen years. And that's the use of vaping, the vaping
Yeah.
equipment. Have you seen
Yes.
like a lot of use of that by young people in your school?
Yeah, I meant to mention that sooner, so I'm glad you're bringing it back up, because if there's one thing that's entering our schools and has been there, and it doesn't seem to be, I mean, I guess it's diminished a bit in the last, like right before 2020, it was definitely even more of a problem. We saw less of it last year, but we've already had a few occurrences this year that I'm aware of, and I only find out about students that I'm interacting with.
Mhm.
So it's definitely still present, and it's not only nicotine; they're vaping THC. So
Yeah.
there's that part of it too, that people might not be as aware of. And it's so, like it's in the bathroom or in the locker room or in the hallway and places where there may not be as much supervision. And being faced with that choice, like, okay, yeah, I went into the bathroom with my friend. I didn't know what they were going to ask me to do,
Right.
or I thought I could just go along and just kind of, hang in the background. But now suddenly I'm being asked to use this. So,
Yeah. Because some
yeah,
of the options would be certainly say no, if you're in the bathroom and you're approached, so the decision is whether or not I'm going to use this vape that I'm being offered. So definitely a no, like nope. And then you can try it, you know.
hmm
How about some other options? Like you had said, we try to go past that too. Do you have other options that
right.
pop into your head?
I mean, changing the subject sometimes, or just leaving. I tell kids, like, you can just exit, like you don't need
Hmm.
to stick around, or you can state, I don't think this is a good idea, I'm getting out of here. Or
Hmm.
um I try not to encourage them to to make excuses, because then you're always making the same, you're always having to come up with excuses. So unless you know that you're not going to want to be in that situation again, or be with those people, when they're doing that thing, then sometimes just being honest.
Yeah.
Like,
And I love the honesty. I mean, it's, when people are being healthy, like I know when I talk with young people and I say, so if somebody doesn't use a tobacco product, is that usually a negative? like if you have a romantic interest in them and they're not using tobacco products, isn't that a positive? Because if you want to kiss them, they're not going to have the smell of tobacco in their mouth and on the
Right.
clothing,
Yeah.
So that's a positive. And I know too that some of the consequences for vaping, I mean, it's because of how much of the nicotine can be inhaled into the body. It seems like the addiction is quick with vaping products.
Yes. I was just going to say, yeah, so it becomes like that tolerance piece. I'm sure it happens faster. Yeah, and needing to leave the classroom multiple times or multiple periods a day to get your fix.
I know that some young people, they do get addicted to it because again, it's not regulated like how much you'll inhale. I mean, it's more self-control, but if you've never used it, you don't know how to use it and what the lower versus the higher, it's a learning curve. But I know of some young people that have to wake up in the middle of the night to use it. And
Wow.
that's addicting. That's, because a lot of people that use cigarettes don't even do that. So it's unfortunate, and especially since the brain isn't fully developed. So,
Right.
so if you're somebody that's listening in and you have a young person, you can go through this decide model with something like vaping or alcohol, because we know that young people in the preteen years are being exposed to a lot of messages about alcohol, a lot of misinformation still out there about alcohol, even in shows and stuff. So you can go through that. But can I just have a little chat about something that a lot of students have asked me about, which we can use the decide model too, and that's hair removal.
Yeah.
Do you mind if we
Go
go
for
through
it.
the steps with that? Okay. So let's say it's a person who is getting leg hair and chest hair. So the decision is, what do I do with this new growth or darker growth? The options there are what in your eyes?
Leave it, right? You don't remove it at all. Shaving, right? Shaving. I mean, are these teenagers? So I
I'll
don't know
say
if
like pre-teens, like when it starts coming in, let's say if it's like 12, 13, 14. So yeah, it is beginning teen.
right. Not showing your legs. And I think some kids will do that, that they will see that as an option and they're gonna restrict how often they actually let their legs show.
I've had some people ask about waxing. So if we have those four answers right there, the leave it, shave, don't show your legs, or wax, if we look at the pros and cons of leaving it, what would you like? Do you have any thoughts to that?
Doesn't require any extra products, no extra time, no ingrown hairs potentially.
That's a good point. As a
Right.
person who was raised to shave their legs, because I would think some people are like, well, everybody else does it. But what's really neat in 2023 that we're getting it's more acceptable not to shave your legs no matter how you identify.
Right.
How about the pros and cons for shaving?
Well, okay, so pros and cons for shaving. The person might like how it feels better personally, so forgetting about what other people might think, they might find that they like the feel of it better. Other pros, it's more socially acceptable still, at least that's still kind of the norm for some. Cons for shaving. Oh, well, I guess the products, the time, the cuts, the razor burn.
Yeah. In which, if you are going to choose to shave, please have somebody teach you how to do it correctly.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Do you know, as a side note, I grew up as a swimmer, and part of the competitive swim world was to not shave your legs before a big meet so that you would then later expose your, the cells on your skin, the nerve endings, so you would feel the water better.
Okay.
And you would feel smoother and faster, and there was like a mental piece to it. So I would go like at least a month to 2 months in my teen years without shaving. And then I remember the first time I was in a hotel bathroom with my mom, and she was showing me how to shave my legs for my very first, major swim meet. And yeah, so I at least had my mom showing me the way, but I think I got into it because of my sport. I wonder when I would have started shaving if it wasn't for being a swimmer and shaving right
Interesting.
before that big meet. Yeah.
Interesting.
This conversation just brought up that memory.
Well, what are some of the downsides for shaving? Which I will admit that means stubble.
Yes, right. The upkeep, like how often am I going to do this? Because then, yeah, it gets past a point where, it's better to not do it anymore. You get into
Hmm.
that phase. Other cons, I guess, figuring out what razor is going to work for you.
Yeah, and like you said, it's time consuming. Yeah, that kind of thing. And
Yeah.
then the pros and cons for not showing legs.
Yeah, I guess pros, you don't worry about anyone finding out that you're not shaving your legs, but the con is that that's got to be exhausting to try to continue to hide yourself and
Yeah.
in hot weather, Yeah, I can just imagine it being mentally exhausting.
And then waxing, I don't mean to put you on the spot. I don't know if you've ever experienced waxing. I have.
Nope.
Okay. Because I will say one of the positives is that it is smooth, usually because waxing will remove from the root. When you shave, that's just the surface layer of the hair, but when you wax, you actually pull from the root. So if I used to have my lower legs done, and it's like one of the negatives is it's costly. You can do it yourself, but you still have to buy the product and you have to make sure you follow those hygienic practices. But it also doesn't tickle. It can be, especially the first times, I have to pluralize that, or right before I getting a menstrual cycle, because sometimes you just feel things a little bit more because it wasn't always comfortable.
Mm,
And if you do choose to remove more hair, different parts of the body, like I'm thinking of the bikini area, yeah, that kind of wakes you up.
yeah,
If I
I
say
bet.
it like
I
that.
bet. Right?
Yep.
And in my mind, I've always equated waxing with the bikini area as opposed to legs, but I could see, I mean, it's certainly an option, right?
Yeah. In which for anybody, hair for the most part, I would say armpits, all of these options are there. For the legs, bikini area, the legs, chest, and back hair. Because I have noted in the media that sometimes they show young males that like models that have no chest hair. And I always
Yep.
wonder, that's a choice. You don't have to do it, but if you're going to do it, like the shaving, it's going to come back. And I remember an old Jerry Seinfeld episode. I know I'm showing my age, but he started shaving his chest and it was growing back and he was like scratching himself like a werewolf
Mm,
or something like that.
yeah.
But to wax, that could also, you're going to have to be expecting to have some discomfort.
Right.
So for this decision of shaving or anything else, remember, if you're a young person listening in, this is a personal choice. And sometimes though, the value part, like you might be of in a certain religion or culture that doesn't support you removing body hair. So, and that's something to discuss with family members, like, so you might have limited options at that point until you're older.
Right.
So, is there anything else you'd like to share, Kathleen, about decision making or any advice about growing up to our audience?
Um, the only thing that I was contemplating sharing or not, but I think it's worth sharing because I'm sure I'm not the only one out there who's experienced something like this. But certainly when I was experiencing it myself, I felt very, alone in it. I started going through puberty when I was 9 or 10, so
Okay.
definitely much sooner than the rest of my grade, which made me quite an easy target for teasing and being picked on. And because I obviously was going through changes that they weren't noticing in other people. And I remember one year, I think I was in seventh grade, it must have been seventh grade or eighth, where a group of boys had taken my yearbook. I had given it to them to write in. I thought they were going to write something friendly, and they took song lyrics and they changed it to be words related to like my breast development, completely picking on my breast. And I remember my parents had taken my yearbook and they were looking through it. And I distinctly remember my dad seeing it, and I like grabbed it out of his hands and I was like, it's nothing, it's nothing. It's just a joke. But that was a perfect example of when I could have brought the fact that I was being mistreated to an adult to help me kind of navigate the changes I was going through. But I didn't even know like how. I didn't want my parents to know I was being picked on,
Yeah.
and so I kind of just tried to avoid the conversation. But no fault to my parents, but I don't think I really had any conversations with them about what I was experiencing, so it was hard to experience that. And then I became very self-conscious about my body, especially that part of me, throughout I'd even say my life. It's just something that was tough to go through. So I'm glad that your podcast is here and other resources to help people navigate those really essential conversations we need to be having, you know.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm sorry, because I know that, for me, when I was in fifth or sixth, there was that girl that blossomed earlier. And sometimes it seemed like she did get more unwanted attention. And it was to no fault of her own because she was growing her breasts.
Right.
But our
Right.
society seems to focus on certain things. And at the same time, we're really fortunate now that we have more things in place in schools. It should be in schools that if somebody is being harassed, is being bullied, is being like, we're not supposed to be staring at body parts. And we teach young people to go to these resources, and that it is inappropriate to hurt other people's feelings, to focus on those body parts. Would you agree that, like, even in your school, it's more cognizant to make sure nobody's getting picked on?
Yes. Yeah. Especially for things like that. I mean, the bullying is still occurring, but it's more subtle. I feel like these days, where it's happening on the social media side of it, there's definitely less address from what I've seen, of people's appearances for the most part. But, and that brings up another thing too that kids are making decisions about, is just how are they going to express themselves,
Mm.
during this time of figuring out who they are, and how are they going to show that to their peers, and, and will they be accepted or not?
You're right, because how they dress. I mean, I remember I think it was seventh and eighth graders, they would get to school and how they got off the bus, they were dressed one way, but then they'd run to the bathroom and they came out looking differently, whether it be with makeup or, because
Yeah.
certainly we don't want to show certain body parts and we don't want to see anybody's underwear. I don't never want to see that, but
No.
they're experimenting with who they are, their identity.
Yeah. 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 So I think it's happening less, but it's still present. And I try to just stress to the students, without sharing too much about my own personal story, because there's a certain amount that's okay, but then other times where it's just like, I don't want to always just be talking about what I've experienced, right? But I
Right.
want them to know that no matter where you are on the puberty spectrum, right, with the changes you're going through, it can be uncomfortable. So if you're developing sooner than your friends, or if you're developing later, like, everybody's going to catch up in the end. And it's tough no matter where you are. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Kathleen. And as a conclusion, do you mind just reading what the DECIDE acronym is again?
Yep, no problem. So DECIDE stands for defining the problem, exploring your options, how can you address that problem, considering consequences, thinking about the pros and the cons for each of the options you've brainstormed, identifying your values, thinking about what matters most to you and which option is going to honor who you are and who you're trying to be. And then you decide and act. And then lastly, take the time to process and see if you were happy with the decision, and if you would make a different choice next time.
Excellent. And I'll have a link for where people can see that visually on today's description. So I'll make sure that the DECIDE acronym is available in some way to our listeners. And I thank you so much again for being here, Kathleen. And thanks for doing everything that you're doing for your students, for your community. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here. It's an honor, honestly. This is awesome. So thanks for the chance.
You're welcome. And to our listeners, again, if you want more information about the DECIDE acronym, I'll put a link. Feel free to connect with me. Please decide to connect with me. You can reach out to me at pubertyprof@gmail.com or go to pubertyprof.com. That'll get to my website. You can also decide to talk with your children about, this is an easy way or an easier topic to start talking about puberty. If you haven't spoken with your child before, or if you're feeling uncomfortable, start talking about the decisions that are going to have to start being made, because as children get older, they do become more independent. It's that growth. Yeah, so hopefully you learned something today, and thanks for listening in. And I hope that you have a happy and healthy day.
Thank you for listening to the Puberty Prof podcast, where information and tools are shared to help you have conversations about puberty and other growing up topics. Did you enjoy this episode? Please like, share, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also follow the Puberty Prof on Twitter or Instagram. The Puberty Prof, Lori Reichel, wants to hear from you. Go to pubertyprof.com or click on the link in this episode's description. There you can find more information, as well as ask questions to be answered by the Puberty Prof in a future episode. That's pubertyprof.com. Also, remember to check out the Talk Puberty app and the book, Common Questions Children Ask About Puberty. Until next time, this is the Puberty Prof podcast, where information and tools are shared to help you have conversations about puberty and other growing up topics.